Well, it's good to be part of the Lake Union again, even for just a couple of days, but enjoyed being with you here today. And today this evening as we conclude, we're going to be talking about the future of our children and adolescents. Particularly in the area of emotional intelligence. What is it? It's understanding your emotions and the emotions of others and responding to those emotions in a healthy way. Sounds pretty simple, but it's very involved. Our behaviors powerfully influence our thoughts and emotions. This is why when we're teaching emotional intelligence to children and adolescents, we have to talk about behaviors and what even enjoyable things they can do to improve their emotional intelligence through behaviors. But when it gets down to it, after the behaviors can improve our hardware, the software of the brain is even more important, and that is our thoughts that cause our emotions and behavior. And so we have to teach our little ones to analyze their thoughts and correct their thoughts, which is something that we have found can be done. Aristotle mentioned many years ago there are many ways to demonstrate anger, and anyone can become angry. That's what? Easy. But to be angry with the right person and to the right degree and at the right time and for the right purpose and in the right way, that is not within everyone's power, and that is not easy. I actually don't quite agree with that statement. Once we know the principles of emotional intelligence, it is within everyone's power to do precisely that. Emotional intelligence likely contributes more to successful and enjoyable living than even IQ does, according to the studies. In fact, so much of our academic world is based on IQ. You're learning, you're retaining, you're applying the knowledge, and that's how you get A's in academia. But this is the neglected aspect of academia. And we have math every year, we have science, we have reading, we have social studies, we have all these required classes, nothing on emotional health or emotional intelligence in virtually all of our schools. But emotional intelligence is learned. That means it should be as part of the school and academic curriculum. And since it's learned rather than inherited, it can be improved upon. There are 5 components of emotional intelligence. The first is knowing our emotions. That means to be able to identify what we are feeling, but not only what we're feeling, why we're feeling that way. And if the why is related to that person cut me off in traffic, and that's why my emotions are this way, we are not understanding our emotions. Because it's not that they cut us off in traffic, it's because our thoughts about them cutting off us off in traffic actually caused our emotions. And so it's your thoughts and it's my thoughts that cause our emotions. Yes, activating events are an important aspect of that. We can't neglect the activating event, but we should also not neglect our own thoughts. Some people get a little disturbed when I tell them that it's their thoughts causing their emotions, because they're saying, that means you're blaming me. But you know, thank God it is our thoughts that cause our emotions, because we can change our thoughts. And we can change our thoughts into what's true and accurate, and that can powerfully immediately affect our emotions positively. Once people learn how to do this, which is something that even kids, this is what you're going to talk about, kids can learn how to do this. This is far quicker than popping a Xanax pill to make you feel better. It happens in a microsecond of helping you feel better. But you have to learn how to do it, and you have to practice it. The second aspect of emotional intelligence is managing your emotions. People with low emotional intelligence are managed by their emotions. moment by moment, day by day. They're simply being managed by their emotions. People with high emotional intelligence still have powerful emotions. The difference is they're managing those emotions. And that underscores something that Dr. Baumeister, who is now the most quoted researcher in all the world from Stanford, states will solve the #1 problem in all the world. What does he call the #1 problem in all the world? It's not what the politicians are talking about. Whatever the politicians are talking about, they're majoring in minors because they won't talk about the elephant in the room. The #1 problem in all the world is lack of self-control. And you know, when you look at it, even during the COVID pandemic, heart disease killed more people than COVID. We know how to prevent heart disease, and we even know how to reverse it through nutrition and lifestyle. So if heart disease is killing over 1,000 people a day in this country, it's not the heart that's causing their disease. It's lack of self-control. Cancer, Harvard says we could prevent 80% of cancers if we would just put into practice in our daily lives what is healthiest for us. So cancer even killed more people during the COVID pandemic than COVID. But we could say that lack of self-control was behind 80% of those cancer deaths. And then when you look at even COVID itself, 95, latest study showed 96% of COVID deaths were not just due to COVID. There were a few, but most of them were due to comorbidities plus COVID. By the way, the #1 comorbidity associated with COVID death was obesity, but you probably don't know the #2. Because the CDC, it's in their data, it's clearly the #2. In fact, it was right up there with obesity, almost tied with obesity as being the #1 comorbidity associated with death. It wasn't diabetes. It was related to stress, anxiety. Anxiety is a strong immune suppressor, particularly when it comes to viral immunity. And anxiety also has bearings in regards to emotional intelligence. Recognizing emotions in others. It's not just about us, but it's about our relationship with others. Managing relationship with others, called social intelligence. And then finally, motivating ourselves to achieve our goals. There's people that have high IQ, but low motivation. And those people will not be your 4.0 students in school. You could have a high IQ person get a 2 GPA. Is the problem their IQ? No, the problem is their EQ. And in the word emotion is another word, motion. If our emotions are based on what's true and accurate, it will powerfully motivate us to achieve our goals. By the way, we talked about marijuana earlier. One of the characteristics across the board of marijuana is lowering motivation significantly, except for where you're going to get your next marijuana from. By the way, lack of self-control also tends to come with marijuana usage. And sometimes we'll have people come to our program that are marijuana users that tell us they have no self-control. And actually, everybody does have selective self-control. And I'll tell them, they'll say, not me, I have no self-control. I said, you're pretty careful about the soil you put your marijuana plants in, aren't you? Do you water those on time? Oh yes, I water those on time. And so they do have selective self-control in that area. Yeah, it's been called the silent killer of emotional intelligence, marijuana usage as well, but part of it is due to the motivational aspect. Children with better self-control are actually more popular with other children, not less popular. You can predict a child's SAT score at age 6. This was a study being looked at in 6-year-olds. And then it accurately predicted their SAT score at age 16. And it was just based on how much self-control they had at age 6. So we think it's important in regards to what school they went to and all of those things. Yeah, those are minor variables. The major variable is the self-control of 6-year-olds. Displaying self-control by the age of 11 is highly correlated with successful employment throughout participants' lives. Participants with low self-control experience 3 times as many months of being unemployed over 22 years when compared with those with high self-control. So even unemployment rates, very much related to the self-control you had at age 11. Improving emotional intelligence, which is something we can all do because it's learned, can effectively prevent or treat depression, phobias, obsessive-compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, anorexia, bulimia, and even addictions such as alcoholism. In fact, studies show that if we combine the 12-step program, AA, with a program that improves emotional intelligence, it will increase your success 4-fold. 4-fold. Why is that? Because most people, when they withdraw from alcohol or withdraw from anything, they have a tendency to get into stinking thinking now that they can't numb their thoughts. But if we can straighten out the thoughts, which is what emotional intelligence will do, instead of the first year of sobriety being the worst year of your life, which is what you're going to learn about in AA, be patient. Your first year of sobriety is going to be the worst year of your life. Your first year of sobriety will be the best year of your life because you no longer have the stinking thinking. It can also, of course, prevent or treat violence against family and others, which is one of the reasons why we were asked to develop the curriculum we're going to explain. And it also helps prevent or treat relationship breakups. So many individuals in today's world, this is one of the differences too in this generation versus previous generations. But when breakups occurred in previous generations, people would be disappointed, they'd be depressed and those type of things, but they would not be thinking of taking their own life. Now among young people, when relationships break up, that's one of the first things they think about, is actually ending their own life, their inability to cope with breakups. And it's really, that inability to cope has to do with their lack of emotional intelligence. But it also helps normal people think clearer, communicate more effectively. It fosters unity in group settings, reduces polarizing statements, promotes a happier life, and all of this is accomplished without compromise or sacrificing the truth. Well, when we start looking at the CDC data and other data about mental disorders in children, it's pretty alarming. ADHD, anxiety problems, behavior problems, and depression are the most commonly diagnosed mental disorders in children. As we look at those 4 disorders, in the years pre-pandemic, you might say, why am I looking at those years? Because the CDC has not published anything more recent than this. Although they have published the fact that it's worse, and they're going to be coming out with the data, but they have to, massage that and make sure how accurate it is. But this was just pre-pandemic. ADHD, 9.8% of children having ADHD. That's 6 million children in our country. 9.8% ADHD, 9.4% anxiety. Behavior problems, 8.9%, and depression, 4.4%. So almost 3 million of our children having depression. Ever having been diagnosed with either anxiety or depression among children aged 6 to 17 increased from 5.4% in 2003 to 8% in 2007 and to 8.4% in 2011 and 2012. However, something occurred in 2012 that increased this dramatically. Notice the 2018-2019 reporting. 15% now with major depression, 36% with persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. That's over a third of our children, persistent sadness and hopelessness. 4.1% having substance abuse prior to 17, and 1.6% having an alcohol use disorder, which of course is illegal for them to be even utilizing alcohol. 3.2% an illicit drug use disorder, 18.8% seriously considered attempting suicide in just that school year of 2018-2019. That's 1 in 5 of our children at that adolescent age seriously attempting suicide. 15.7% went so far as to make a suicide plan. 8.9% of them attempted suicide, and 2.5% made a suicide attempt requiring medical treatment. So they ended up in an ER, injuring themselves and needing significant treatment. That's 2.5% of all of our adolescents in the United States. Mental, behavioral, and developmental disorders can begin in early childhood. 1 in 6 children aged 2 through 8 had a diagnosed mental, behavioral development disorder. And diagnosis of ADHD, anxiety, and depression become more common with increased age. So they can get it early in age, but it becomes much more common as they age. Now notice here, these are the graphs in regards to what happens when children age. But if you notice at age 5 or less, you don't see, even today, rates of depression in our young people. In order to have depression, it turns out you have to have a frontal lobe. You have to be able to reflect upon yourself. This is one of the reasons why we never see suicide in the animal kingdom. Their frontal lobe is not large enough to reflect upon themselves. So even in their worst state, they might be in severe pain, they might be having a most terrible hour or day or multiple days, animals will never consider taking their own life, despite doing that. So the frontal lobe is required to begin to reflect upon yourself, and you can see that frontal lobe starts to develop, particularly after age 6. So 6 to 11, you see significant rates of depression, but notice after 12, it goes up considerably after the age of 12. Now, anxiety you can have even though you don't have a frontal lobe. So notice the 5-year-olds or less can have anxiety. By the way, animals can have anxiety. My boy had a Sheltie that had significant anxiety. It made me decide to develop an anxiety recovery program for animals. It would want out of the house, and as soon as it got out of the house, it wanted back in again. Always very anxious. Kids can be anxious too under the age of 5, but at 6 to 11, much more anxiety, and notice how much it goes up 12 to 17. Behavioral problems obviously can occur in 5-year-olds or less, but notice how much more in 6 to 11-year-olds. It tends to come down a little bit once the time of adolescence arrives. But when did mental illness begin to skyrocket, particularly in this country? 2012. What was significant about that year? That's when 1/2 of Americans owned a smartphone. Since that time, we have looked at it in every country since. In 2019, I was in Kenya. Depression was almost unheard of in Kenya. But in 2019, rates of depression were skyrocketing in Kenya, including suicidal thoughts. And when I was there speaking, they had their Kenyan national newspaper, rates of depression going up. And then their next day, their headline was, "Shock linked to smartphone usage," the depression. And that was the year that 50% of Kenyans owned a smartphone. And so there's something about this technology that's been associated in every country that it's looked at, and it's one of the reasons why depression and anxiety is skyrocketing, not just in America, but every year. And of course, it's a lot more than half of Americans owning it now. And by the way, did smartphone usage and technology usage go up or go down with COVID? It was actually forced. Forced technology usage in all of our young people. And we'll talk about why this is the case. And as I mentioned, there were two pandemics during 2020 to 2022. There was the COVID pandemic, but even more significant in regards to its impact economically and otherwise was the mental illness pandemic that occurred. Major longitudinal study looked at the lives of over 1 million young people. Teens who spend large amounts of time glued to phones and computer screens are markedly more happy? Markedly what? Less happy than those who prefer real-world activities and interactions. Social media, texting, video chatting, multi-platform video games, all associated with a decrease in happiness. Now, our kids will convince us that they have to have this in order to be happy. But the data does not support the lies they're telling themselves about these screens. Youth who invested more time in non-screen activities such as playing sports, reading newspapers, engaging in face-to-face social interactions were significantly happier. The life satisfaction, self-worth, and happiness of young people in the U.S. plummeted after 2012, the year when the proportion of Americans owning a smartphone rose by over 50%. So the happiest teenagers are those who use digital media less than what time? 1 hour per day. After a daily hour of screen time, levels of unhappiness rise steadily. And it doesn't matter what we're utilizing our screens for. You might think, well, social media, they can connect, that'll make them happier. But social media actually makes us antisocial. We're attracted to it as a means of connecting to our real life social, friend group. But studies show soon virtually everyone ends up comparing far more than they connect. And comparing ourselves among ourselves is not wise, particularly when we're comparing among a false world that looks true. Let me give you an example. I was on a tour boat touring one of the most beautiful spots in the country, I should say in the world, Milford Sound in South New Zealand. And it's a fjord in a rainforest, 5,000-foot cliffs, waterfalls coming down, and you're out here in this boat with dolphins leaping in front of you. It's just drop-dead gorgeous. And we're out there, and my dopamine levels are naturally going up to a nice high, but then they quit going to a high because two ladies were arguing in the front of the boat on this beautiful tour. And they were not happy with each other. We got close to a waterfall, and so the boat slowed down, and these two ladies fortunately quit arguing. They got out a device, they put their arms around each other, they smiled real big, they took this picture, they uploaded it to their Instagram account, and they resumed their argument. Now, all of their friends thought, we're slaving back here at work, and look what they're doing. They're having this great time in New Zealand. But if they would have seen what I would have seen, they wouldn't have been a bit jealous. They would have been thinking, what in the world? You're down there taking a vacation, and you guys can't even get along on a boat in a beautiful area of the world with all of this fresh air and everything around you. And we need to realize these people that upload these pictures of themselves on social media, they've taken about 1,000 pictures of themselves and tried to get the lighting just right until they found one that looked least like them, and then they posted it. And this world is so image-oriented, and so jealousy occurs, and so we have social appearance anxiety at an all-time high. We have good-looking college students that come to us. They don't want to get out of their dorm room. They'll go to the cafeteria. They'll go right back to their dorm room because they don't look as good as some of their friends on social media. And you know, they don't realize those social media accounts are doctored, and a lot of these images are doctored. Yesterday I was going through an airport to get here, and I don't know their names, but I did see a headline a few weeks ago. But there's a name of someone that has some sort of makeup brand that's trying to sell and kind of part of pop culture. Last name starts with a K. So, you know, there's a picture of her there in the airport. And I was looking at that picture, and I know from the report 6 weeks earlier that it has been significantly doctored. Someone actually uploaded a picture of this girl without going through Adobe Photoshop first, and the anger that came out in regards to, what, you're going to actually show me the way I really am? You know, they're actually quite below average on those pictures that haven't been doctored. And it's like, and this is what people are getting upset at, and if they don't get the likes and whatever. But it goes beyond that. What we're finding out is even more important than what I mentioned, is when we get on a device to do something, and by the way, kids are told to get on their device to do their homework. You know, now you have to research things on the internet and do your homework. And so get online and do your homework. Studies show within 3 minutes, the student is not doing their homework. They had full intention of getting their homework done. But why are they not getting their homework done? They got distracted. And you know, you can't blame them, because the engineers have figured out that this person that's now online doing their homework likes BMWs. And so as soon as it's on, okay, this person likes BMWs, there's a BMW that floats across the screen right in front of the homework page. And it says there's a new BMW, it's an A33 or whatever, and it's over at your local, oh, I didn't know that one was coming out. Well, let me just click on it. It won't hurt to click on it here a little bit. And then you click on that, and pretty soon you get distracted as you're looking at that, because a friend now knows you're online and so does a little video or a little chat like this. Then you might get a little Snapchat from somebody else, and then all of a sudden the news flash. Donald Trump is handcuffed and put in a New York prison. Oh, I've got to see this. And so you get on this. And so, you know, and it's kind of innocent in a way. It's not like any of those things are bad. But what's the brain effect of this? The brain effect is on the anterior cingulate gyrus of the frontal lobe. This is the area of our brain that needs focused attention. And our brains were designed as we get older to be able to really focus and have very good attention for even hours at a time. But when we get continually distracted, the anterior cingulate gyrus says, you don't need me. This is the focus area. You're never focusing on anything for more than 3 minutes. And so it begins to prune and tear down the anterior cingulate gyrus of the frontal lobe. That induces ADHD. By the way, you don't need to have any genes for ADHD now. ADHD will come about in every child from the normal use of screens because of the distracting element that happens. But it's more concerning than that. Not only can they not focus now for more than 3 or 5 minutes, but the area of the brain that's needed for focused attention is identical to the area of the brain for managing distressing emotions. And so now they can't manage distressing emotions. If you can't focus for a long period of time, you're not going to be able to manage distressing emotions. The good news about this situation is if we intentionally begin to focus and no longer allow ourselves to get distracted, that anterior cingulate gyrus will be needed again and it will start building up. But it takes time. It takes about 6 weeks. So when people come to our program and they're hooked to their phones and they're using it for hours a day, we're taking their devices away from them. By the way, many of our young people that come to our program say, I would rather not eat for 10 days than you take my device away for 10 days. I mean, this is how I treat my depression and anxiety. I need my device. I need all of this. And we have to remind them in 10 days, because they're so much better in 10 days. We have to remind them, you got better without your device. But you need another 4.5 weeks. You've been a week and a half. You need 4.5 weeks to really build that up. So we'll put them through an electronic fast for 6 weeks. Now, we learned this from Victoria Dunkley. Victoria Dunkley is a child and adolescent psychiatrist in LA. And she's seen the explosion of all of these child and adolescent mental health disorders. And she says, I've learned that I will not diagnose anybody, any child, with any mental illness until they've given up their screens for 6 weeks. She says after that, they don't have ADHD. They don't have depression. They don't have anxiety. Their mental health normalizes in many cases. Now after that, if it hasn't, then she'll get out her diagnosis book and she'll begin the diagnosis part. But many of these mental illnesses are just induced from the normal use of smartphones. Now, we will tell them, you might say, well, how can you live without a smartphone? You actually can. Your life is not dependent on having one of these devices. But there can be useful aspects to it. And what Cal Newport's books are worth reading, but one of them that we assign to people that need an electronic fast is a book called Digital Minimalism. By the way, Cal Newport is a 30-something-year-old computer programmer who is such a good computer programmer, he makes $1 million a year, and he refuses to work more than 40 hours a week because he wants to have a balanced life. And he says, if you are good at something, they will find you without you being on the internet. So he's not out there on the internet, but he has written some books in regards to how to have an excellent brain like he has. But he was very intentional to never have a social media account. He was very intentional to allow his brain not to have all the complications of the media aspect of things. And he states that we should look at our device apps the way the Amish look at technology. How do the Amish look at technology? They decide, is it worth it? Yeah, we realize there's benefits here, but what is it going to take away from our family life? What is it going to take away from our spiritual life? What are going to be the consequences of utilizing this? And so, if you're going to waste time on YouTube, it's not worth it. Don't even have the app there. But you could have your GPS there. I haven't found anyone to get lost in their GPS app. I mean, as far as just being focused in on this GPS app for hours at a time and being distracted. It doesn't happen. And so there are certain things that can be very healthy for us in regards to that app, but is there a consequence? And if you're wasting any time whatsoever on an app, it should be eliminated. It's not worth it. And we can do this. We help them reprogram their devices when they go home so that they can't have this. We had at our last EQ summit in February, we had a young man that was suicidal, a couple of different attempts, all sorts of issues, did have some family challenges, etc. And he became addicted to his phone. He was 19 years old. He's 21 now, and he has been doing so well in so many ways. And so when I was interviewing him up there, I said, you know, you used to have a problem with YouTube. I said, can you get on YouTube now? He says, well, let me try. He went to YouTube, and it said, blocked. Cannot get on there. And it made such an impression that one of the doctors from Utah that's in charge of several thousand youth is inviting him to the youth conference he's doing to show how the youth can actually have a far better life. He is having a far better life, and his brain has actually come back, his emotional intelligence has come back significantly as well. Media devices waste a lot of time, sometimes hours each day. They keep us from doing healthy activities, from spending time with our families and engaging in productive work. The issue is children actually learn more from their devices now than they do from their parents. And they tend to trust their devices over their parents in surveys. Now, why does this happen? Well, they might ask, what is the population of Chicago, to their parent? Their parent might not actually know that answer, but Siri does. And Siri can tell you what the population was in 2020. So if Siri knows this and Siri knows that, then you can ask Siri, what gender am I? And the technology companies will be glad to tell you that if by any chance you're thinking this or that, you are not the gender that you were born biologically with or whatever. And then try to convince them in regards to all of this. By the way, all the 10 leading technology companies will be in agreement on this gender issue, despite the fact that it's not quite science or data like what the population of Chicago is. And so, and then, of course, they can get caught into that aspect of things. By the way, what do we call these types of things that are increasing in our society today? We call them, this is what we call them in the psychological world, they're disorders of assumption. Disorder of assumption. One of the classic disorders of assumption is an anorexic who looks in the mirror and sees themselves as fat. They look in the mirror, I'm too fat, I've got to quit eating. Is the solution to that, to dealing with an anorexic when they go see a medical doctor, is to tell them, you are fat. You do that, you can kill that anorexic. And so to deal with disorders of assumption, we have to help them understand themselves, not that we're telling them, but we have to help them understand themselves what reality is. And so this is where it's very important to go into reality and not just have to officially approve the assumption that they've made, because that ends up making them worse in the long haul. And of course, you've seen examples of that in our society today, where people have affirmed the disorders of assumption only to get sued by those individuals years later because of the permanent changes that they made in themselves that they can't reverse back as a result of now realizing that they had a disorder of assumption that was never addressed. Well, the issue is, it's not just children using these devices, parents use them as well. And when parents use their devices, children tend to use theirs even more. And allowing kids free access to smartphones gives them access to the creeps of the world. We can give examples of this. We had a 6-year-old upload a picture of herself and saying, I'm looking forward to my friend's birthday party tonight, and posted it on a social media site, and within 24 hours, she had the creeps texting her. Does your mother allow you to date? Can we see you without your top on, a 6-year-old? Those sorts of things being forwarded, and then all sorts of other stuff in regards to the creeps of the world now having access to the 6-year-old. Daniel Goleman, who is a person who popularized the term emotional intelligence. He didn't make the term, but he came out with his book 1990 on emotional intelligence. He's written a book called Focus, the Hidden Driver of Excellence, and he says one of the keys to success is a digital Sabbath. How often? Every day. A digital Sabbath is a time when adults and kids are not distracted by devices, and during that time engage in focused learning or healthy activities. And this is something that needs to be taught and also applied. So we already talked about that. By the way, once you get back to screens, it's very important after the 6 weeks that you get rid of all the push notifications. If Donald Trump gets arrested, you don't want to have a push notification in the middle of a focused task. It won't do you any good to learn about that 1 hour earlier. In fact, if you don't learn about it on your cell phone, I can guarantee you'll learn about it from someone in a face-to-face interaction after that. And it doesn't really make any difference. And so you want to get rid of your text notifications, your email notifications, those sorts of things, so that when you are on the device doing something useful, you can totally focus and not be distracted. Developmental hits are also a problem that is dramatically increasing in our society. We call them adverse childhood experiences. Abuse is at an all-time high, physical, emotional, and sexual, and neglect is also at an all-time high. By the way, one of the areas that parents don't consider neglect is giving their child a device so that they have a babysitter that's not paid for. That's actually neglect. And it's going to cause some serious consequences down the road. Household dysfunction, mental illness, divorce, substance use, violence against mother, incarceration of a relative or a caregiver. Only 25% of children now are raised by both biological parents at the same time now, from 0 to 18. And so there's a lot of those things going on. And those are developmental hits that are going to come out when there's other hits, particularly on board, driving this mental illness in children. Speaking of relationship with parents, 91% of children who don't have a good relationship with their mother or father will have a significant disease by the time they're age 50. If you have a good relationship with one but not the other, 50% chance you're going to have a serious disease. But if you have a good relationship with both of them, it goes down to 25%. So that means 3 out of 4 people won't have any serious disease. They'll be very healthy mentally and physically by 50, just by having a good relationship with mom and dad. By the way, we shouldn't be surprised about this, because the commandment says, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy what? Days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. And one of the most significant factors is the father in the household. This is looking at children of loving, authoritative fathers. Now, it doesn't say loving fathers that just take their kids out to movies or to do things that their kids want them to do, or to shower them with gifts. By the way, when there's split homes, fathers often do that. They want to be popular, but they're not authoritative. In other words, they don't call the children to accountability. And being loving and authoritative means that you're also calling them to accountability, but what a difference it makes versus those that don't have loving, authoritative fathers. Higher chance of being an A student, higher IQs, better problem solvers, more likely to enjoy school and be engaged, higher economic educational achievement. You're better able to handle strange situations. You're more resilient in handling stress. You're more curious and exploring. You have less depression, and you have improved life satisfaction. You're also more likely to succeed in work. You're more dependable, you're more trusting, you're friendlier, you're more mentally healthy, you're more socially accepted, and you're more popular and well-liked, and you have more pro-social sibling interactions. In addition, you have higher conformity to rules, have long-term successful marriages, have more long-term close friends, have higher empathy for others, higher moral values, and notice this, 80% less likely to be in jail. When we start looking at different groups and looking at differences in incarceration, the ethnicity part of things disappears when we look at, did they have a loving, authoritative father that they grew up with? 75% less likely to become unwed parents, and better physical health as well. And so having this as one of your heritages, and I'm going to guess that most people in a room like this who are more successful and wanting to learn and things like that, probably if I asked you, the majority of you would raise your hands saying that you had this. But if you go out in the streets of Chicago, you're going to see a far different hand rate, and maybe 1 in 100 in some sections of Chicago that actually have this, and thus they have all of those increased risks. So there are behaviors, fortunately, that can improve EQ. Developmental hits are there, and they're important to recognize because when they come to our program, there's different attachment disorders that occur as a result of those developmental hits. There's unhealthy attachments and things, and we can help them through the cognitive aspect of things. But physical exercise improves fitness. We've already talked about improved neurotransmitter receptors and release as well as production, improves cognitive function and mood and memory. We've talked about diet. Junk food diet will actually lower your ability to learn, retain, and apply knowledge. Over 4,000 kids in 4 different age groups looked at and controlled for all the known factors that affect IQ, but the 20% with the highest processed diets, higher in fats and sugar, 5-point lower IQ, compared with the 20% who ate the more health-conscious diet. But if you look at the top 1%, which were essentially whole plant foods eaten whole, you see a 15-point increase in IQ. Major influence on IQ, our emotions are largely controlled not by our behaviors, as important as those are, but by our beliefs, our evaluation of events, the way we think about problems, and our silent self-talk. Your feelings result from the messages you give yourself. Your thoughts have much more to do with how you feel than what is actually happening in your life. And you know, we can understand that for those that understand Bible stories. I don't know if you remember Paul and Silas. They were taken against their will. They were beaten with rods. Their backs were laid open. And they were doing things that were good for society. By the way, that's the reason why they were taken. If you do things that are so good for society that you start changing the economics of society, for instance, they're no longer buying marijuana, they're no longer buying alcohol, those sorts of things, expect to have the politics come down on you. It's going to happen. And so Paul and Silas, who had done nothing wrong, were put and thrust in this jail, their feet put up in stocks, their backs had been laid open, and there they were crying uncontrollably in prison and saying, "Why us, Lord?" Some of you know that story. The first part of the story is true. What was the second part? They had happy looks on their faces, singing praises to God. Why could that be the case? Because their thoughts had much more to do with how they were feeling than what was actually happening in their life. And those thoughts were not fantasy thoughts or pop culture thoughts. They were true and accurate thoughts. But true and accurate thoughts can be so powerful that even under the most adverse circumstances, we can still be emotionally healthy and stable. So we teach them the ABCs of CBT. The A is the activating event, and traditionally we think this is what's resulting in our emotional consequence. Obviously that wasn't the case with Paul and Silas. They had a terrible activating event, but their emotional consequence was not terrible. Dr. Ellis says A to C thinking is crooked thinking, believing that we have little or no ability to influence our feelings and events and situations directly cause our emotions and behavior. But instead, we can have the belief with the activating event, and if that belief is rational and helpful, what a difference it will make on our emotions and then on our behavior. God is opening the way for medical missionary work. And the medical clinic, the Adventist clinic in Guam said, what can we do now that you've introduced this to all of our public schools and things? And I said, well, first of all, they're going to be very well aware of us, so I would encourage you to run the Depression and Anxiety Community Program in your clinics. They're going to be able to know about that and access that better. And also, offer them the spiritual help. We couldn't in the public school system do the final T, the trust in God, but it does open the way for them to want to do these changes in their life, and when they go against human nature, they really need to have the spiritual resources to help them. Often we think the health message is disconnected with issues of salvation, but notice this statement. The light God has given on health reform is for what? Our salvation and the salvation of the world. And as we present the health message in its true light, it can also help us as we engage with it, and it can help open the way of salvation to the world around us. So I want you to pray for this project, and I'd like to open it up to see if you have any questions before we close about this particular aspect. Yes? Do we have a curriculum for homeschoolers? And the answer to that is we will have it by August 1 for homeschoolers. We also have a curriculum for Christian schools as well. I think chances are we'll be unveiling that at the NAD Education Conference in August. They're looking at us to present that. And we have actually run that Christian curriculum in Weimar Elementary, Weimar Middle School, and Weimar High School as well. So we piloted it there, and it's also been piloted in several islands in the Pacific. So Christian schools were utilizing our Christian curriculum, but mostly the piloting was of the public schools. Any other questions? Yes. Go ahead.
Will you include some of this new information into Optimize Your Brain program?
Yes, so the question is, will we include this in the Optimize Your Brain program, some of the new information? Let me tell you what one of the chief judges on the island, he texted me the other day. Let's see if I can find his text. I might not be able to find it. But essentially, I can tell you he was asking for us to do that as a way of helping people to not have all the recidivism in the judicial system. And so he's wanting that Optimize Your Brain curriculum for adults. The Optimize Your Brain curriculum, we've come out for college kids and adults, and also academy kids. And so we still have that curriculum. So if you're wanting to enhance your emotional intelligence and your IQ, we have that curriculum available. However, it is Christian-based, and for the court systems to mandate it, they're wanting us to upgrade it like we did this curriculum and have that be government-friendly. So that is one of our next tasks, is to try to get that done, and hopefully we'll have that done in about a year. But we're prioritizing this curriculum first. Yes?
Do you have any camp meetings or short programs, 1 week, 1 month?
Yes, so do we have some short programs? We do have short training programs in our Emotional Intelligence Summit at Weimar. We have pre-trainings and post-trainings for a couple of days there. And so you can do that. And also at the Indiana camp meeting, I know your Indiana conference president had to leave because it's a 3-hour drive back to with him. But he's asked us to put on a training for the community program at the Indiana conference camp meeting. So if you want to learn how to put on a training program for helping people to overcome depression and anxiety, you can sign up at the Indiana camp meeting. That'll be in mid-June, and we're going to be running a training there.
Where can we search all your schedule where we can listen to?
Yeah, good question. We probably need to be putting that up probably on our Facebook or one of our sites in regards to that. But yeah, our social media sites might be a good place to get that. Yes?
In 1977, I read an Albert Ellis book, which helped me tremendously, helped me proceed into a pretty good career. And I was wondering who, cognitive behavioral therapy, what books right now are the most up to date?
Okay, so he mentioned that Dr. Ellis had a big influence on his life, rational emotive behavioral therapy, and he read one of his books in '77. Ellis and Beck are considered the pioneers of discovering cognitive behavioral therapy, and their books are still good today. The books we utilize today that are very helpful are The Lost Art of Thinking. We also have Learning to Tell Yourself the Truth by William Backus, and then SOS for Emotions by Dr. Clark, Lynn Clark. And those are the books that we utilize on the CBT part of things for the adults. However, we do have a textbook. I didn't mention it. We have a textbook for children called Millie. Now, in Guam, we had to change the culture and put it in Islanders. It's called Tua, but it's a great book that introduces the 10 different ways of distorted thinking. And children love it, and for adults that have a problem with CBT, they get it when they read the children's book. And so parents have talked about the significant own mental health that they've gotten on doing it. And we've had some kids love that book so much that they've memorized the entire book. And of course, that really helps them to correct their thoughts once they have that book memorized, because it's multiple stories that illustrate the 10 different ways of distorted thinking in children. The title of it is called Millie, and it's written by one of our therapists who has 4 small children and does a lot of child and adolescent CBT, and it's well done. All right, well, I hope this is helpful, and I will turn it over to your ASI leadership. May God bless you in your own quest for emotional health and the emotional health of our younger generation.